Night had settled deep over the valley, thick and unmoving, like a blanket laid across the breathing earth. A faint crescent moon drifted above the ridgeline, pale and distant, unable to wash away the darkness gathering below. The ranch slept in uneasy quiet, but the land itself seemed to stir, as though the season had finally turned a page neither of them were ready to read. Inside the cabin, the fire was little more than an ember glow. She sat near it, long silhouette bowed over a length of sinew she was threading into a bowstring, each pull deliberate. Her movements were calm, but her eyes, those sharp, desert-etched eyes, remained fixed on the door as if listening for a sound only she could perceive. The rancher rose from his small writing desk, rubbing weary hands over his face. The ledger before him was almost blank. It had been for months. Money flowed through his life the way water slips through cracks in stone, briefly, then gone. Yet the silence in the room no longer felt like loneliness. Her presence, quiet as it was, anchored him like a lodestar. "Storm coming?" he asked softly. She did not look up. "Not the sky," she murmured. "The ground." He waited. She rarely spoke without reason. She laid the bowstring aside and finally met his gaze. When riders come once, they return. But when they flee, they bring others. A long exhale left him. He stepped to the window, gazing into the moon-washed yard. The barn sat still, the animals restful, the fence line stretching like a shadow in the distance. But even he could feel it, an unease running beneath the soil, a tension in the air as if the land braced itself for something approaching on a slow, inevitable wind. He thought of the men who had come for her. Hired hands, bounty seekers, the kind who never left unfinished business alone. But there were others out there, too, those who would want to use her survival as leverage, those who might see her as a symbol, or a threat. And worse, those who'd see the ranch as a prize. "Then we prepare," he said. A simple statement. A heavy truth. She nodded once and returned to her work, tightening the final knot in the bowstring. Her movements held a calm resolve, an understanding older than the fences around them. She tugged the string, and the new tension hummed softly, like a warning. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the cold scent of winter and something sharper, something metallic. Something human. He reached for the lantern and lifted it to the window. The light caught the edges of the ranch yard in trembling amber. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. And yet his heart beat with the quiet throb of a man who had spent too many years learning to mistrust silence. Behind him, she rose, blade sheathed at her side, bow in hand, posture tall and watchful. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floorboards, like arrows pointing toward a future neither could yet see. "Whatever comes," she said, "we face it standing." He nodded. A solemn pact. A beginning. As the lantern flame flickered, the night around the ranch thickened, no longer empty, but listening. Waiting. Gathering. The land remembered what violence sounded like. And it remembered how to echo it back. Morning rose pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself were reluctant to climb over the ridges. The ranch lay still, too still. Not the gentle stillness of peace, but the tightened quiet that settles before a storm finds its footing. He stepped onto the porch with cautious boots, scanning the far hills out of habit more than fear. But the land answered him with unease. Even the wind seemed muted, slipping through the fence posts like a whispered warning rather than a breeze. Inside the cabin, she moved with the same sharpened instinct. Her footsteps light, breath steady, eyes narrowing as she lifted her bow and inspected the fletching of each arrow. There was no panic in her movements, only the delicate certainty of a hunter marking the change in the air. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Some mornings carried messages only the wounded could read. He found the first sign near the old water trough, a single boot print pressed cleanly into the drying mud. Not fresh enough to signal an immediate attack, yet recent enough to chill the blood. He crouched and touched it with 2 fingers. Cold. Deep. A rider who wasn't afraid to come close. She appeared at his shoulder, silent as dusk. Her gaze hardened, not with fear, but recognition, of the pattern, the angle, the riding style implied by distance between tracks. Not the same men, she murmured, voice low, almost reverent with warning. No, he replied, standing slowly. Something else. The land hummed around them, an old tremor they had both lived through in different worlds, danger, not yet visible, but inevitable as the shifting seasons. A raven cut through the sky, circling once above the property before disappearing toward the north. She followed its path with her eyes. In Apache tradition, such a sign was never ignored. In his life as a rancher, he had learned the same truth: when animals carried messages, a man was wise to listen. She tightened the leather guard on her wrist. He checked the worn revolver at his hip. A distant echo, hoofbeats. Or imagination. The horizon held its breath. Whatever was coming toward them rode with intent, and it carried neither the banner of her people nor the signature of the bounty men they had driven off. This was new. And the land itself seemed afraid to name it. The second sunrise found the ranch unnaturally quiet, as though the land itself were weighing its breath. A thin ribbon of cold mist drifted along the fence line, clinging to the boards like a warning left by the night. The tall Apache Huntress stood outside the cabin, bow resting loosely at her side, her eyes scanning the horizon with a patience carved from old suffering. Tracks, those same unwelcome signatures, had multiplied in the darkness. Some sharper, some older, some layered over each other like restless thoughts. She crouched beside them, fingertips hovering just above the impressions but never touching, as though touching would give the unknown riders power they didn't yet deserve. Inside the cabin, the poor rancher watched her through the open doorway. There was no fear in her posture, only calculation, the slow, quiet mathematics of survival she had learned long before their fates ever crossed. He envied that calm. It made his own pulse feel loud, clumsy, boyish. He stepped outside, boots crunching softly in the thawing ground. "Closer this time?" he asked. She nodded once, a gesture more solemn than any speech. The air between them grew heavy with the realization that whatever force circled the land had not vanished after the standoff. It had only grown curious, or impatient. A hawk screeched overhead, wheeling sharply before vanishing behind the ridge. She watched its path, reading it like scripture. "They test your borders," she murmured, voice low, shaped by wind and caution. He swallowed, throat dry. "Or test me." Her eyes shifted toward him, dark, steady, strangely gentle. "No," she said softly. "They test us." The words hung in the cold morning air, quiet but undeniable. A shared fate. A shared threat. And whether either of them wished it, a shared future shaped by riders they had yet to truly meet. Night surrendered slowly to a bruised, uncertain dawn. A pale wash of amber touched the edges of the sky, yet the land felt unchanged, tight, listening, as though the earth itself withheld breath. He stepped onto the porch with his coffee tin steaming faintly in the cool air. The boards beneath his feet creaked like old bones adjusting. In the distance, the plains rolled out in muted shades of ash and gold, beautiful yet somehow apprehensive. It was a land that knew when danger had memorized its roads. Inside the cabin, she moved with the deliberate quiet of a woman reconciling instinct with circumstance. The Apache Huntress checked her bowstring, fingers running along it with a tenderness reserved for objects that had outlived entire chapters of her life. Her eyes flickered to the window, watching dust rise in the far distance, too faint to be threat, too persistent to dismiss. He noticed her tension through the open doorway. "Tracks from yesterday," he murmured. She didn't turn. "Not your cattle. Not your neighbors." The simplicity of her words held weight. The world was narrowing around them again, invisibly but undeniably. A hawk circled overhead, spiraling slow, its cry splitting the morning silence. She watched it with a gaze he couldn't decipher, as though reading an omen written only for her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Whatever follows, it is not finished." He felt her meaning in his bones. The riders who had tested the edges of their solitude were not done. They were gathering nerve, or numbers, or both. And the land, old as time and twice as honest, warned them the way it always did, quietly, without mercy. He set the tin aside, exhaling. "Then we stay ready." For a long moment, neither moved. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of coming heat. The day waited on the edge of something. Night settled early, as if the sky itself had grown weary of holding back the dark. A cold wind swept across the ranch, driving dust against the cabin door in thin, restless breaths. Inside, the lantern's flame swayed with each draft, throwing slow-moving shadows across the walls like memories trying to resurface. She sat beside the window, her bow across her knees, gaze fixed on nothing she could name. Ever since they found the second set of tracks near the ridge, tracks too heavy, too deliberate to dismiss, her silence had deepened into something almost ceremonial. The rancher, leaning against the hearth, sensed it without needing words. He had seen that kind of quiet before in soldiers returning from war, the silence of counting ghosts. He approached her only far enough for respect. "You know those men," he said softly. Not accusation. Not suspicion. Just the steady truth. Her eyes shifted toward him, burning with an old pain that hadn't cooled. "They ride for blood," she murmured, voice low as embers settling. "Not for honor. Their leader, Taza's brother, lost face when my band escaped them months ago. He means to reclaim that shame with violence." The rancher rubbed a thumb along the grain of the wooden table. "Why here?" She hesitated, only a moment, but long enough to show it mattered. "Because they believe I hide among the dead." He frowned. She gestured toward the west pasture, her expression hauntingly calm. "Your land was once a burial place for our wanderers. Not marked, not spoken of, but known. To them, this place is a veil, somewhere a woman like me could vanish into spirits. They think the earth itself shields me." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the revelation settle over the room like dust on an unvisited grave. "So my home is holy ground," he murmured. "No," she corrected quietly. "It is remembered ground. There is a difference." The wind pressed harder against the shutters, as though trying to enter and carry their words away. For a long moment, neither spoke. The land outside felt suddenly older, heavier, as though the soil itself had been listening all along. Finally, she lifted her bow, testing the string with practiced fingers. "They come closer," she said. "And when they do, we must stand not as fugitives or hosts, but as keepers of this place." He nodded, the understanding settling deep into his bones. Some land demanded cultivation. Some demanded defense. And some, like this forgotten burial ground between two broken lives, demanded witness. Night came early that evening, curling around the ranch like a watchful creature. The air carried the faint metallic scent of coming frost, and a pale moon struggled to rise through a veil of thin cloud. She stood at the doorframe with her bow slung across her shoulder, the faint outline of her figure made silver by moonlight. He joined her quietly. No words passed between them. None were needed. Far across the land, beyond the distant ridge, a glimmer of movement betrayed itself, no more than the faint shift of silhouettes. The kind of motion only hunters, scouts, or men with hard intentions made under the cloak of darkness. He narrowed his eyes. "They're still out there," he murmured. She did not look at him, her gaze remained fixed on the ridge. "They watch," she answered softly. "They measure." A long silence followed. The night seemed to listen. She stepped forward into the cold, testing the wind with the subtle intuition of someone raised by a people who understood land as if it were kin. "These men carry no Apache scent," she said. "Their horses breathe with impatience. They wait for fear to open a door." He exhaled slowly. "They won't find it here." Her eyes drifted toward him, dark, steady, silent. There was something in her gaze like the calm before a storm. "You carry the weight of your land," she said. "But you forget, I carry the memory of pursuit. And memory, always returns." He felt those words sink deeper than he cared to admit. The wind shifted, brushing dried grass into a soft hiss. Coyotes called in the far distance. Then, faint but unmistakable, a metallic clink echoed across the ridge. A stirrup. A rifle butt. The careful sound of men repositioning under cover of shadow. She lifted her chin. "Tonight they count our courage." He turned toward the barn, toward the tools he might need, the lamps that needed lighting, the preparations a man makes when the world presses against his fence line. "And tomorrow?" he asked. She answered without hesitation, voice quiet but resolute. "Tomorrow, they test it." Night settled heavy upon the ranch, a deeper darkness than usual, as though the land itself sensed the approaching tide of conflict. The huntress sat by the low-burning fire, shoulders rigid, gaze fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. The rancher watched her from the doorway, her stillness, her quiet, the way her breath trembled ever so slightly. He stepped inside with careful footsteps, boots brushing softly across the plank floor. "You've been holding something," he murmured. "Something I ought to know." Her eyes lifted, not defiant, not afraid, but worn by a truth she could no longer shelter. "My people," she began, voice threaded with sorrow, "they believe I should have died with them. Warriors do not return alone." The fire crackled, punctuating the confession like a judgment. "And you?" he asked gently. Her jaw tightened. "I have no place to return to. Only ghosts." He lowered himself beside her, allowing silence to stretch just long enough to acknowledge what she had entrusted him with. "Then stay where the living are," he said quietly. "Ghosts can't claim you here." Her breath shuddered, a fragile, unguarded sound, and in it lay the beginning of a truth neither had wanted to face, that survival brings its own kind of exile, and its own longing. Night pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick and unmoving. The lantern on the table guttered softly, its flame bending with every faint draft that slipped through the cabin seams. She sat by the hearth, legs folded beneath her, mending the strap of her quiver with deliberate, unhurried motions. He watched from the opposite chair, sharpening a worn blade against a whetstone, each stroke like a whisper of metal on quiet stone. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them had become something familiar, no longer a gulf, but a space where truths settled gently before being named. Finally, she paused. "The riders," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the quiver strap rather than on him. "They will not forget this place." He nodded once. "I figured as much." She lifted her gaze. But there is more. Her voice carried that measured weight he had come to recognize, truth announced without dramatics, just honesty shaped by pain. Those men, someone leads them. Someone who hunts my people across every border white men draw on maps. He leaned back, jaw tightening. A name? A face, she said. One I've seen before. The quiver strap slipped from her fingers. The night my sister fell. The blade froze in his hand. The room seemed to shrink around her words. He didn't press her, not yet. She breathed slowly, as though choosing which memories to let rise and which to leave unspoken. He rides with no tribe, no loyalty but coin. He takes Apache captives for bounty. Women. Children. Warriors. The old. Her hands closed into fists. He believes us prey scattered across a wide desert. The rancher's eyes darkened. And he followed you? Yes, she whispered. And he will follow again. A log in the hearth cracked sharply, sending sparks upward. In the flickering light, her face looked carved from shadow and flame, resolute, but weary of a violence that kept chasing her across every horizon. He set the knife aside. Then we'll meet him together. Her eyes softened, not with sentiment, but with the quiet recognition of shared consequence. You choose a hard path, she murmured. He gave a faint, tired smile. I've been on it a long time. Outside, the wind dragged across the plains like a long breath. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called into the night, the note long and thin, as though echoing her story back into the dark. The fire settled into embers. And in that quiet, an unspoken truth took root, their pasts were no longer two separate burdens. They had begun to braid themselves together, like strands drawn from the same length of shadow. The canyon air tasted of iron and old storms as they rode through its narrow throat. Sunlight barely filtered in, just thin, trembling ribbons that clung to the rock walls like fading memories. Every hoofstep echoed too loudly, as though the land itself was warning them that this place had known violence before, and had not forgotten it. She guided her mare with an instinctive, ancestral surety, posture rigid, eyes scanning every ridgeline. The huntress carried tension like a drawn bow, she felt something watching them, listening to their breathing, counting their heartbeats. He weathered the silence beside her, sensing her unease but not breaking it. The rancher knew some fears were older than language, shadows passed down through generations, warnings shaped by centuries of collision between worlds. A loose stone skittered down from above. She halted instantly. Her hand rose, not to reach for a weapon, but in that subtle Apache gesture that meant the land is speaking, be still. He obeyed. Wind shifted, carrying with it a bitter scent he recognized too well, sweat, black powder, and unwashed greed. Not warriors, mercenaries. Men without tribes, without honor, without ghosts to answer to. The kind who hunted anything that breathed if the price was right. She dismounted slowly, touching the ground with her palm. The dust told its own story, fresh tracks, 6 riders, moving fast, circling southward. Not toward them, not yet. But toward something that mattered. She looked up at him, jaw tight. They are hunting for sign, she murmured, voice low as a dusk prayer. Not only mine. Anyone tied to me. He felt the weight of her meaning. If he remained at her side, their fates were no longer separate threads, they had been braided together, pulled into a larger pattern neither had chosen. A distant crack split the air, like a rifle fired far off, carried by canyon winds. Her eyes hardened. His did too. Whatever peace they had carved out of the wilderness was now behind them. What lay ahead was a test, of resolve, of loyalty, of the quiet bond they had formed under the roof of a dying ranch. They mounted again, but neither spoke. The canyon had shifted. So had the world around them. Night rolled in early, settling over the land with the heavy stillness of something waiting to be named. The cabin glowed faintly from within, amber light breathing through the small gaps in the walls. Outside, the world felt watchful. Even the wind moved with hesitation, brushing the grass in low, uncertain sighs. He stood on the porch, rifle resting loosely in his hands, not as a threat, but as a recognition of the land's new temperament. Trouble had returned to these hills. He could feel it in the dry prickle of the air, the way the horizon seemed to pull its edges in tight. Inside, she sharpened her arrows with steady, careful strokes. Every movement was patient, every breath quiet and centered. She had been raised for moments like this, for nights when danger pressed close enough to taste. Yet there was no hunger for violence in her. Only necessity. Only the old knowledge her people had held long before the fences had divided the earth. When she stepped outside, he glanced at her, not as a ward, nor a burden, nor a rescued stranger. Something in her posture had changed. She stood as if the land spoke through her bones, as if the darkness belonged to her and she merely chose to share it. "You feel it too," he murmured, voice low, steady. She nodded once. "The ground speaks before the men do." A simple answer, but it carried weight he felt in the center of his chest. They walked the fence line together, each footfall measured. A faint unease trailed behind them like a shadow that did not obey the moon. By the time they reached the northern corner of the property, they saw the sign, subtle, but unmistakable. A broken branch. A boot print pressed into soft earth. Someone had stood here long enough to watch them. Long enough to choose a moment. She touched the print with her fingertips, then straightened slowly. Not the same men as before. "How can you tell?" "Men with fear step lightly," she said. "Men with certainty, step like this." A chill rolled down his spine. They returned to the porch, their silence no longer a barrier but a shared understanding. Whatever was coming was no longer a test of their alliance. It was the consequence of the world beyond them, pushing inward. A world that refused the peace they had built with quiet hands and smaller dreams. When he set the rifle beside the door, she laid her bow next to it. Their weapons, different in shape and spirit, rested side by side, like the two of them, shaped by different histories, now bound by the same threat. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we choose our ground." She met his gaze, unblinking. "We already have." The night deepened. Far off, a coyote cried, long, rising, mournful. It felt like a warning. Or a promise. Night settled over the ranch like a solemn vow, its silence deep enough to hear the earth breathe. The lamps inside the cabin burned low, casting a honey-colored glow over rough-hewn walls that had seen grief, mercy, and now something approaching quiet understanding. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes, hoofbeats fading into the distant dark, reminders of dangers that had come close, and would likely come again. But tonight, neither of them flinched at the sound. She stood near the doorway, her bow unstrung but close at hand, posture tall yet eased by a rare softness. The huntress who once drifted at death's edge now seemed rooted, steady, as though the land itself had claimed her. He watched her quietly from the table, sharpening a dull knife with slow, thoughtful strokes. Every scrape against the stone sounded measured, intentional, an act closer to meditation than preparation. For a long moment, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary, the silence held their shared history like a vessel. Finally, she turned toward him. Her voice emerged low, threaded with the cadence of her people. "Storms no longer frighten me here. He paused the blade, lifting his eyes. Storms pass, he answered. And you've weathered harder ones than I have. She stepped closer, studying him with calm certainty. Not alone. The admission hung in the air, fragile yet powerful. It wasn't a confession of dependence, no, it was something deeper. A recognition of chosen kinship, forged not by blood but by burdens carried side by side. He nodded once, silently accepting the truth of it. For years he had lived in the hollow left by loss, believing no soul would ever stand beside him again. Yet here she was, half warrior, half mystery, marking the cabin with her quiet resilience. She touched the wooden horse he'd carved long ago, still resting on the shelf, still gleaming from the night he'd offered it as a bridge between worlds. This place, she murmured, thumb tracing its smooth edge. It remembers. And it forgives, he said. A faint smile touched her lips, small, fleeting, but real. Then perhaps I stay longer. The land feels less angry now. He exhaled slowly, not realizing until then how tightly hope had been clenched inside him. You stay as long as you want. Outside, a coyote's distant call broke the stillness, a lone cry that once signaled threat but now sounded simply like life continuing somewhere beyond the fence line. She moved to the hearth and sat, letting warmth embrace her shoulders. He joined her, setting aside the knife at last, letting the settling quiet become part of them both. Two wounded spirits, once scattered by fate, now steadying each other in the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival. The wind outside shifted direction, gentling as though acknowledging their choice, two lives no longer drifting aimlessly, but turning quietly toward the same horizon. The year's final frost clung to the fence rails like a quiet blessing, thin and glimmering under the early sun. Winter had settled into the ranch not as an enemy, but as a patient teacher, slow, hushed, and honest. The land no longer felt wounded by intrusion, it breathed easier now, shaped by 4 steady hands instead of 2. Inside the cabin, the hearth smoldered with the remains of last night's fire. She moved through the room with practiced ease, placing dried herbs above the window frame, each tied with thin sinew. It was an Apache tradition for safeguarding a home. He did not ask about it anymore. He simply nodded, accepting the meaning without requiring the explanation. The days had taken on a quiet rhythm, her tending the horses at dawn, him splitting wood by the creek, both returning to the modest meals they cooked together. Nothing extravagant. Nothing hurried. Just the steady labor of 2 people breathing in the same direction. Sometimes she sang. Not the morning song from their first nights, but a softer one, still low, still ancient, but lighter, like the desert wind brushing over tall grass. He listened with head bowed, not out of sorrow anymore, but gratitude. The kind that seemed to grow from the soil itself. The threat that once darkened their horizon felt distant now, reduced to a memory that no longer controlled their steps. What remained instead was something quieter, sturdier, 2 lives repaired not by grand gestures, but by the slow courage of choosing each other again and again, day after day. And when evening settled, stretching shadows across the plains, they would stand at the doorway together. Not speaking. Not needing to. Just watching the land they had survived, and the life they had made from its silence.